From the day Mom died, Dad looked at me differently as if he knew something I couldn't say out loud. It was almost funny how silence could scream louder than words. Or maybe funny wasn't the right word, maybe it was tragic. The day after my mom's funeral, Dad didn't cry. He just stood by the kitchen window, staring at the backyard like he expected her to come back. And when he finally looked at me, it wasn't grief that flickered in his eyes. It was something sharper. Something knowing. I'm Aiden Reyes, 19 years old, living in Columbus, Ohio. For as long as I can remember, Mom was the soft place I fell when everything felt too hard. And Dad, well, Dad was there. Big, quiet, a mechanic who smelled like oil and worn leather. We weren't close. Until Mom died. That's when he started looking at me differently. It wasn't just in the obvious moments like when I stumbled through telling him I wasn't going to follow him into the family garage, or when I said I wasn't dating anyone. It was deeper than that. It felt like he could see through me. Past the clothes, past the silences, straight into the secret I'd been keeping for years. I was gay. And I hadn't told a soul. Except maybe Mom. Her last words to me, whispered in the hospital bed while Dad stepped out to take a call, still rattled around in my skull. You don't have to carry it alone, baby. At the time, I didn't know what she meant. But now. Now it felt like she knew too. Dad didn't say it outright. He didn't have to. There were these loaded silences. These glances. Like the night after the funeral when he found me on the back porch, clutching a photo of her. The air smelled like rain. You okay, kid? I didn't answer. And then his voice, low and steady, you know, your mom loved you for exactly who you are. I remember my stomach knotting so hard I thought I might puke. I hadn't said anything. Not once. The thing is, when you grow up queer in a house like mine, all quiet tools and silence, you learn to read between the lines. To speak in code. So I kept quiet. Days turned into weeks. Dad didn't push, but that stare of his never stopped. Like he was waiting for me to say it. Like he already knew. Until one night everything blew up. It was a Friday. Late August. The air was thick and sticky. I'd just gotten back from a party at Mason's place, a friend I'd known since middle school, though friend wasn't really the word for what I felt for Mason. I had kissed him that night. Under the stars, behind the garage. It wasn't planned. It just happened. But kissing him felt like breathing. Like I'd been holding my breath my whole life and finally let it go. Of course, the first thing I saw when I walked in the front door was Dad sitting in his armchair, the TV off, a beer sweating in his hand. Waiting. Where you been? His voice cut through the quiet like a blade. My heart stuttered. Just out, I said, shrugging off my jacket. My hands were shaking. I hoped he didn't notice. Out with Mason. My blood went cold. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. How? I know, Aiden. Dad's voice didn't waver. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was just there. And that scared me more than if he'd yelled. He set the beer down, leaned forward. His eyes locked on mine. Your mom knew too. That's why she said what she did before she passed. I swallowed hard, throat dry as dust. The room felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in. I don't. You don't have to say it if you're not ready, Dad said quietly. But I want you to hear this from me, it doesn't change a damn thing. That's when I broke. Right there in the middle of our worn-out living room, I started crying. Harder than I had since Mom died. Dad didn't say anything else. He just stood up, crossed the room, and pulled me into a hug. For the first time in years, I let him. It wasn't the end of things. There were still hard days after that. Still moments when I doubted myself, when old habits kicked in and I wondered if I'd ever really be enough for Dad, for the world, for myself. But from that night forward, things were different. We talked more. Little by little. About Mom. About me. About Mason. And when Mason came over for dinner 2 weeks later, Dad shook his hand like he would any other boy. No weirdness. No questions. Just quiet acceptance. Looking back now, I think Mom had known exactly what she was doing, planting that last seed of courage in me before she left. And Dad? He'd just been waiting for me to catch up. It wasn't perfect. It never is, not in real life. But it was real. And real is enough. The first time I said it out loud wasn't even to Dad. It was to myself. Late one night, lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. I whispered it so quietly I wasn't sure if I'd actually spoken, "I'm gay." That word, so sharp and terrifying my whole life, suddenly felt small. Human. But things moved fast after that. Dad started inviting Mason over more often. Football games. Grilled burgers out back. It was weird, seeing them side by side, me silent, rough-edged father, and Mason, all nervous smiles and skinny jeans. One night, Mason and I sat on the porch steps while Dad fiddled with the barbecue behind us. Mason leaned in close, murmuring, "Your dad's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Mason grinned. "I dunno. More yelling." I snorted. That's the old man's superpower. Intimidation by silence. Mason bumped my shoulder with his. "Yeah, well, I like him." And for some reason, that meant more to me than I could explain. The real test came a month later. It was the Columbus Pride Festival. I'd never gone before. Not officially. I'd watched the parades on TV. Scrolled through pictures online. But actually going, being there in person, terrified me. I didn't tell Dad I was thinking about it. But Saturday morning, as I stood in front of my closet, frozen between a plain gray t-shirt and a rainbow one Mason had given me, Dad appeared in the doorway. "You're going, aren't you?" I jumped. I don't know." He stepped in, holding something small in his hand. "I figured you might." He opened his palm. It was a pin. A tiny enamel heart with rainbow stripes. "It was your mom's," he said quietly. "She kept it hidden in her jewelry box. I found it after she passed." I stared at it, throat thick. "She wore it?" Dad shrugged. "Maybe not out loud. But she wore it where it counted." I didn't cry that time. I just pinned it to my shirt. The festival was overwhelming. Thousands of people. Music blaring. Rainbow flags everywhere. At first, I stuck close to Mason, barely lifting my head. But somewhere between the marching bands and the drag queens tossing candy into the crowd, I felt something shift. The weight I'd carried for years, it wasn't there anymore. I was just me. And that was enough. Halfway through the parade, I texted Dad a picture. Me and Mason. Smiling. Didn't expect anything back. But a few minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Dad, looks good, kid. Proud of you." That message hit harder than anything else that day. Pride wasn't just a parade. It was freedom. When we got home that night, sweaty and sunburned, Dad was waiting on the porch. He stood up as we approached. Mason looked nervous as hell. But Dad just clapped him on the shoulder. "Treat him right, okay?" Mason nodded, eyes wide. "Why yeah, sir." "Good." I laughed, shaking my head. "You really don't say much, huh?" Dad just smiled. For once, it wasn't that heavy, knowing smile. Just simple. Light. Over the next few weeks, life found a rhythm again. I helped Dad at the garage sometimes, mostly paperwork. Mason and I spent lazy afternoons in the park. Sometimes we argued. Stupid things: what movie to watch, where to eat. But even the fights felt normal. It wasn't until fall hit that things changed again. One night, Dad called me into the living room. He was sitting there with an envelope in his hands. "What's up?" I asked. He held it out. "College application." I blinked. "What?" "I know you were looking at Columbus State. Figured we could fill this out together." I didn't even know he'd noticed. "I thought you wanted me to stay close. Help with the garage." Dad shook his head slowly. "Your mom always said, let him find his own way." I sat down beside him, staring at the envelope. All those years I thought I had to fit into his world. Turns out, he'd just been waiting for me to make my own. We spent the next hour filling out forms. Talking about majors. Dreams. It felt good. And when I finally mailed that application, I wasn't scared anymore. 2 weeks later, an acceptance letter arrived. Dad opened it first, grunting in approval. "You did it, kid." Mason was there too. We celebrated with takeout pizza and cheap root beer. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mom. Wondering if she'd be proud. I like to think she would be. Her heart pin still sat on my dresser, a quiet reminder. Sometimes, life hands you things you don't ask for. Grief. Fear. Secrets. But sometimes, it hands you exactly what you need. A quiet father who sees more than he says. A boy with a shy smile who makes everything feel possible. And a little enamel heart, tucked away, waiting for the right moment. That was my story. Not perfect. But real. And for me, that was more than enough. Leaving home wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. On the morning I left for Columbus State, I stood in the driveway, my car packed with duffel bags and an old guitar Mom had given me years ago. Mason hugged me tight, murmuring, "You'll call me every night, right?" I laughed quietly against his shoulder. Every night might be a stretch. Dad stood a few feet away, hands shoved in his pockets. His eyes scanned me like he was memorizing everything: how my hair curled at the edges, how I always tied my shoelaces twice. "You sure you got everything?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah. All right." His voice caught, just for a second. "Drive safe, kid." For a second, I thought he might pull me into a hug again. But he just clapped me on the back, rough and steady. "That was Dad for you." As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them both standing there, Mason with his hands in his pockets, Dad with his arms crossed, both watching me go. It felt like leaving one life behind to step into another. College wasn't as scary as I expected. My roommate, Jeremy, was cool, a graphic design major from Toledo who spent most of his time listening to old-school punk music and sketching things in the margins of his textbooks. He didn't blink when I mentioned Mason. "Cool, man," was all he said. Like it wasn't a big deal. That kind of quiet acceptance was new for me. But I appreciated it. Still, there were hard days. Days when the silence in my dorm room felt too big, too empty. Nights when I missed Mason's laugh or the smell of Dad's coffee brewing before sunrise. And there were moments when being openly gay didn't feel safe. Like during my second week, when a guy on the bus sneered at me and Mason as we held hands downtown. The words he threw at Usugly, sharp, hung in the air long after we'd gotten off. Mason squeezed my hand tight, jaw clenched. "You okay?" I nodded, even though my chest felt hollow. Later that night, I called Dad. His voice crackled through the phone. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," I lied. But the silence between us wasn't as comfortable as it used to be. After a pause, I added, just. Rough day. Dad didn't press. He just said, you'll get through it, kid. And somehow, that helped. Weeks turned into months. Classes piled up. Exams loomed. Mason and I settled into a rhythm, weekend spent in tiny coffee shops, quiet nights studying in the library. There were fights too. Real ones. One night in October, after a long week of exams and stress, Mason showed up at my dorm unannounced. "Why didn't you text me back?" he asked, voice sharp. I was busy, I snapped, exhaustion fraying my nerves. "Not everything is about you, Mason." His face crumpled like I'd slapped him. "Right," he muttered, turning on his heel. It wasn't until he was gone that I realized what I'd done. I stared at the door for a long time, heart pounding, before finally picking up my phone. But before I could call him, it rang. "Dad." I didn't answer at first. Let it buzz once, twice. Then, on the third ring, I picked up. "Yeah." His voice was calm. "Steady. You sound like hell." I swallowed hard, leaning back against the wall. I screwed up. What happened? I told him everything. The fight. The silence. The way my chest felt too tight, like I couldn't breathe right. Dad listened without interrupting. Just like always. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then, "You know what your mom used to say about me and her?" "What?" "She said love's not about getting it right every time. It's about showing up. Even when it's hard." That hit me harder than I expected. "I don't know if he'll forgive me," I admitted. Only one way to find out. The next morning, I found Mason sitting on a bench outside the student union, coffee cup clutched in his hands. For a second, I almost turned around. But then I remembered Dad's voice. I sat down beside him. "I was an ass," I said quietly. Mason didn't look at me. But his shoulder brushed mine, just slightly. "I get it," he murmured. "College is a lot." We sat in silence for a while. And that silence didn't feel so heavy this time. When he finally looked at me, there was a small, tired smile on his face. "Truce?" I asked, holding out my hand. Mason took it. "Truce." That winter, I went home for Thanksgiving. Walking through the front door felt like stepping back in time, same creaky floors, same worn-out couch. Dad was in the kitchen, apron tied around his waist like some kind of domestic superhero. He glanced up as I dropped my bag by the door. "Hey, kid." "Hey." We hugged quick, awkward. But a hug, all the same. Mason showed up later, carrying a pie he'd bought from some fancy bakery downtown. Dad raised an eyebrow as Mason handed it over. "You baked this?" Mason laughed. "Not exactly." Dad just shook his head, a ghost of a smile on his face. Dinner was quieter than the holidays used to be. But not in a bad way. Just simpler. Easier. Afterward, we sat on the back porch, the three of us bundled up in jackets against the chill. Dad lit a cigarette, his one vice. Mason leaned against my side, head resting on my shoulder. For a while, no one spoke. Then Dad said, almost absently, "Your mom would have liked this." I swallowed hard. Yeah. Yeah. The stars stretched out above us, clear and sharp. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was enough. Spring semester brought new challenges. Harder classes. A part-time job at the campus bookstore. Mason applying for internships. We talked about the future more now, what it would look like when we graduated, where we'd live, whether we'd get a place together. Some nights, That thought scared me. Other nights, it felt like the only thing that made sense. One evening in March, after a particularly brutal stats exam, I sat in my dorm scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of Mom. Of the house. Of Dad. There was one from the Pride Festival last summer, Mason, and Dad all standing together, the pin Mom had left me glinting on my shirt. I hadn't realized Mason had snapped that one. I sent it to Dad with a simple message, "Thanks for everything." His reply came 5 minutes later, "Anytime, kid. Always." That summer, I went home again. But it felt different this time. Like I wasn't just visiting the house I'd grown up in. I was visiting home. Mason helped me pack. Jeremy, my roommate, gave me a half-hearted hug goodbye. "See you next year, man." "Yeah," I said, smiling. "See you." When I pulled into the driveway, Dad was waiting on the porch. Same as always. But this time, there was something else in his hand. A small box. "What's that?" I asked, stepping out of the car. "Graduation present," he said simply. I blinked. "That's a year away." Dad shrugged. "Figured I'd get ahead." I opened the box slowly. Inside was a key. To what? Dad's mouth twitched in a smile. "Garage next door. I bought it last month. Figured you and Mason could use a place. When you're ready." My heart stuttered. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." I didn't know what to say. So I just hugged him. Tight. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't holding anything back. Not fear. Not doubt. Not words. Because from the day Mom died, Dad had looked at me differently. Not because he judged me. But because he saw me. Really saw me. And now, I finally saw him too. The man who didn't say much. But who always showed up. That was family. Not perfect. But real. And that was more than enough. Summer in Columbus had a way of dragging its feet-long days that bled into each other, heat thick in the air like something alive. By the time August rolled around, I'd officially signed the lease on the garage Dad bought next door. It wasn't much, just a squat brick building with peeling white paint and a faded sign that read Reyes Auto. But it was ours. Mason helped me paint over the old sign one Saturday morning. We stood side by side in the heat, hands streaked with white paint. "What should we call it?" Mason asked, squinting up at the blank wooden board. "I don't know," I admitted. "Not just Reyes Auto anymore." After a moment, Mason dipped his brush in blue paint and started writing slow, careful strokes. "Reyes and Son." I stared at the words, throat tightening. Mason glanced over, brow furrowed. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, voice rough. "Yeah, I'm good." We didn't tell Dad right away. I wanted it to be a surprise. That same weekend, I invited him over for dinner, just me, Mason, and him. Mason made lasagna from scratch. I mostly stayed out of the way. When Dad stepped inside, he took one look at the fresh paint, the sign, the cleared-out interior that we'd started turning into a workshop/living space, and he just stopped. "Looks good," he said eventually, voice thick. We ate in the garage with the doors rolled open, the sun setting pink and orange over the street. For a long time, none of us spoke. Just the quiet clink of forks on plates, Mason's low laugh at something I said under my breath. It felt like everything had settled into place. After dinner, Dad lit a cigarette, standing just outside the garage door. I joined him, leaning against the wall. "You really okay with this?" I asked quietly. "Me not taking over the old shop? Starting my own thing?" Dad exhaled smoke slowly. "Kid, You were never meant to be a copy of me. He flicked the cigarette away, grinding it out under his boot. You're your own man now. It wasn't much. But coming from Dad, it felt like a speech. By the time fall semester started again, I felt like I had both feet in two worlds: college and home, Mason and the garage. Some days, it felt like too much. But most days it felt just right. It was early November when the letter came. I wasn't expecting it. I'd applied to a scholarship program back in the spring, half on a whim, half because Mason wouldn't stop bugging me. When I opened the envelope and saw the words, "Congratulations, you have been awarded," I didn't know what to do with myself. The first person I called was Dad. He picked up on the second ring. Yeah. I got it, I said, breathless. The scholarship. For a second, there was silence. Then Dad's voice, low and warm, "Proud of you, kid." That night, Mason and I celebrated with takeout and cheap champagne. I let myself get a little drunk for once, laughing too loud, kissing Mason like it was the only thing that mattered. Because in that moment, it was. By the time graduation came around in May, everything felt like it had shifted. Dad showed up to the ceremony in a suit. I'd never seen him wear one before. He stood next to Mason in the bleachers, clapping louder than anyone when my name was called. I could see him as I crossed the stage, eyes bright, mouth pressed into that familiar line. It wasn't until after, when we were all standing outside in the sun, that he finally pulled me into a real hug. No awkward back pats this time. Just arms tight around my shoulders. Your mom would have been so proud, he said roughly. I swallowed hard. You think so? I know so. We took pictures. Mason, Dad, me, our weird little family. Later that night, back at the garage, we sat around in lawn chairs with beers and cheap paper plates full of barbecue. It wasn't fancy. But it didn't have to be. Mason rested his head on my shoulder as the sun went down. Dad sat a few feet away, watching quietly. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole. It wasn't about having everything figured out. Or being perfect. It was about showing up. About choosing to stay. A year passed. The garage became both home and business, half workspace, half apartment. I did custom body work mostly. Mason freelanced as a graphic designer and helped me set up a website. We kept the sign, Reyes and Son. People seemed to like it. Dad retired officially that fall. I found him one morning sitting in his old shop, hands folded in his lap. Time, he said simply. I didn't argue. We spent the day cleaning out the office together. Old ledgers. Tools. Pictures of Mom taped to the walls. When we finished, Dad handed me a set of keys. For the old place. Just in case. I didn't need them. But I kept them anyway. Some things you don't let go of, even when you move on. One evening in late October, Mason and I sat on the back porch of the garage, drinking coffee as the sky turned to gold. Ever think about moving? He asked suddenly. Moving where? Somewhere bigger. New York. L.A. I thought about it. About the city skyline instead of suburban streets. About leaving everything behind. But then I looked around at the garage, at the porch, at Mason sitting beside me. Nah, I said finally. I like it here. Mason smiled softly. Yeah. Me too. It wasn't about being stuck. It was about choosing to stay. Because here, I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't the scared kid holding back. I was me. Fully. Completely. And that was enough. The night before what would have been Mom's birthday, I visited her grave. I hadn't done it in a while. I brought flowers. Left them on the stone. Sat in the grass for a long time. "Hey, Mom," I said quietly. I told her about school. The garage. Mason. Dad. How everything had changed. How it had stayed the same. When I stood up to leave, the sky was full of stars. And I felt okay. Not healed. Not fixed. But okay. One last thing. A few months later, Mason and I stood in front of the garage, hands linked. There were no big crowds. No fancy music. Just Dad. A couple friends. And an officiant with a quiet voice. We said our vows in the same place where I'd learned who I really was. Where I'd come out. Where I'd come home. When it was over, Dad hugged me tight. "I always knew, you know," he said quietly. "I figured," I admitted, smiling. He stepped back, eyes shining just a little. "You're happy, kid." "Yeah," I said. "I really am." And that's what mattered in the end. Not how it started. Not what I'd hidden. But what I'd built. What we'd all built. Family. Love. Home. That was my story. From the day Mom died, Dad looked at me differently, like he knew something I wasn't ready to say. Now. Now I said it loud. I was Aiden Reyes. I was gay. I was a son. A partner. A mechanic. And I was exactly where I was meant to be. That was more than enough. That was everything. The end. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.